I think this negotiation, for what it's worth, has been going on for a very long time. And J.D. Vance's comments about things getting close, we've heard it. We've heard the same sort of thing from President Trump and from others many times before. It's very hard to know exactly what this means. And I think it's probably pretty hard for the Americans to figure it out as well, because they're dealing with an Iranian regime which is extremely adept at misleading the people they consider their foes and negotiating in very bad faith. So I think we'll have to see what happens. But even frankly, even if there is a negotiated agreement of some sort, however long it might last, I don't think that's the end of this conflict. I think the Iranians are doing their best to string things out and to play for time. Meanwhile, they hope to get concessions from the Americans on the basis of giving what they would hope come across as good faith agreements themselves. But I would guess if there are any concessions, then in other words, if President Trump decides to uplift the maritime blockade on Iran in exchange for freedom of passage through the Straits of Hormuz, then that's probably just a kind of holding position which Iran will try and keep on to, because, of course, the blockade is causing them immense pain. And meanwhile, they will be trying to rebuild some of the things they lost during the campaign, the recent campaign. And that not only includes infrastructure and some of their leadership, but also it includes ballistic missiles, which we know they're working now on trying to replace as best they possibly can. It's very hard to figure this out as far as the current strength of the United States is concerned. I think the US did a huge amount of damage to the Iranians, and no matter how big they might talk, the reality is they've been very severely humiliated, which is, of course, something very significant in the Middle East for them, and that they've lost a huge amount of their capabilities. So they are dramatically weakened. The Americans have really lost nothing. They've obviously there's been damage to the global economy, which might get worse as a result of the Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz. America's under pressure, I think, to try and get those restrictions by Iran lifted one way or the other. But I think really, I mean, it's very hard. It's really hard to tell from what we're hearing from the negotiations actually what Trump is really thinking. I suspect that President Trump is also, to an extent, playing for time in this negotiation. And part of that is there's two issues concerned here, I think. One is the Hajj in Saudi Arabia, which is the huge Islamic pilgrimage that takes place every year in Saudi. And that's just coming to an end. And the Saudis were very keen, I think, that the hostilities weren't resumed during the Hajj, because that presents obviously religious issues, but also huge targets for the Iranians to attack. So that's one issue, and that's coming to an end. The other issue, I think, is the World Cup, which begins obviously in the second week, I think it is, of June. And I would guess, given particularly that the World Cup's taking place in the United States, that President Trump won't want, if he can avoid it, to resume hostilities while the World Cup's going on. So I think those two factors are definitely relevant, and we might well see a resumption of hostilities once the World Cup's concluded. I think the Gulf states do want Trump to finish off Iran as best he can. And we've heard really strong pressure coming from Saudi not to resume hostilities, but that, I believe, is due to the Hajj, this pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. More than anything else, I think the Saudis actually do want Trump to deal with Iran because they present an enormous ongoing threat to him. And the same with the UAE. The UAE, I think, have been pretty strong in encouraging him to continue attacking. Whether that comes out on the surface or not, I don't know, but that's what's going on beneath the surface. And that applies pretty much to most of the Gulf states, who particularly they've long perceived Iran to be a big threat to them. They know now that Iran is a major threat. Iran actually fired more ballistic missiles and drones at Arab countries than they did at Israel. And they know this threat's not going away. They understand the Iranians probably better than we do, and I think they really will expect and want to see a satisfactory conclusion, whether that is in the form of further military operations or whether it's in the form of a verifiable agreement. We'll have to see, but I think the Saudis and the UAE and other countries will be as skeptical as I am, probably more skeptical than I am, about how to the extent to which anyone can rely on any agreement made by the Iranians. They're adept at failing to meet any obligations they have under international treaties or bilateral agreements or anything. They will say one thing and they'll do another, and I think we shouldn't forget that. This is not a Western country who, generally speaking, you could rely upon to, their word is their bond. I don't think that in any way applies in Iran. I think Iran will do its best to try and flex its muscles and to try and back up its words that it's got basically beaten America into a corner, which is pretty much what it's been saying, which is, of course, not true. They'll try and back that up with as much military action as they feel they can get away with. It's all, one thing to remember, it's not just about the negotiations, it's also about the Iranian regime's pride. That, they have been humiliated. Humiliation is as bad as death in some respects in the Middle East. And so, they will want to continue not just to talk big, but to lash out as far as they think they can get away with it. I think the Americans will have learned a lot from the war as it's unfolded so far, particularly in relation to the Iranian response and, of course, Iranian defenses. Americans and the Israelis together are in an excellent position to create significant difficulties for Iran, even more than were created during the past conflict. And one of their key weaknesses of Iran is their economy, of course, which is in dire straits. And linked to that very closely is their energy. And I think US attacks and Israeli attacks, perhaps on Iranian energy infrastructure, as well as some of their oil facilities, which are critical to their economy as well. I think if they didn't do that to any great extent last time round, I think they will probably have realized that the Iranian regime, is a bit more resilient than they perhaps thought. And they may decide, I think, in the next stage, if it goes to further hostilities, to put more emphasis on targeting oil facilities and targeting the Iranian energy infrastructure and other economic targets. Anything short of regime change in Iran, and I don't mean directly the Americans necessarily putting in place a new regime, but creating the conditions where regime change is more likely to happen. In other words, further damage to the Iranian internal security infrastructure and their capabilities to oppress their people. That could lead, it's by no means certain, it could lead potentially to regime change from internally in Iran. That would be potentially a long-term issue and could result in widespread violence inside Iran as well, which could go on for a very long time. But anything short of that is really, whatever agreements the Iranians make, anything short of that is really kicking the can down the road, because this Iranian regime is not going to give up on in reality, it's not going to give up on its major missions, which is to develop and, when necessary, use a nuclear weapons capability, to rebuild the proxies in the region, and to make war on Israel, and also, of course, to dominate the Sunni regimes in Iran, which pretty much all the other in the Middle East, which is pretty much all the other countries. And when it comes to proxies, I think the critical one here at the moment is Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Iranians want a ceasefire and a permanent cessation of hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. They want that to be part of the deal. And if that happens, then again, that's just storing up further problems for Israel, because Israel currently is fighting, despite the ceasefire that's supposedly in place now. Israel is responding to Hezbollah aggression against its own military and against its civilian population, and is expanding those operations now. Israel, I think, is probably fighting for time in some ways, because there is probably in Jerusalem, there is a fear that a withdrawal by Israel from Lebanon might form part of the agreement. I'm not sure whether it will or not, but that would be a concern. And I think the Israelis probably want to do as much damage to Hezbollah before that does happen, if it happens. Because, of course, if the Israelis agree to withdraw from Lebanon and agree to a more firm ceasefire than's going on now, then what that does is allow Lebanon to build up its Hezbollah rather, to build up its capabilities yet again in a position to a stage where it can seriously threaten Israel.